Susan Summerall Wiles, co-chair of Donald Trump's 2024 presidential campaign, has always been stubborn and confident. Her career in the political world has been a mosaic of decisive actions, strategic decisions, and numerous events, where she has always been at the forefront. She was one of the most influential figures in the campaign, as her views on politics always sparked both surprise and great respect among like-minded individuals. Now, on the brink of a new chapter in her career, Susan received an invitation to appear on the popular TV show The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Everyone thought this would be just another opportunity for her to share her views with a broad audience. But no one expected that this interview would mark the beginning of a new, unpredictable stage in her life. Susan wore an elegant red suit, with no excessive jewelry and simple classic earrings. Her expression was restrained yet relaxed. She was ready for this moment. In the studio's lobby, she was greeted by the team, and within minutes, Susan was sitting at the desk under the spotlight, next to Stephen Colbert himself. The interview began with the usual questions about politics, Trump, and the country's future. Susan answered each question calmly and clearly, demonstrating her determination and support for her candidate's policies. She appeared confident, her voice steady and calm. She addressed questions about immigration, the economy, and national security, but the atmosphere in the studio slowly grew more tense. When Stephen asked her about Trump's latest controversial political decisions that had sparked media debates, Susan paused for a moment. But she gathered herself, and her words became even sharper. Trump is criticized because he's not afraid to go against a system that is actually broken, Susan said. He's not afraid to speak the truth, even if it doesn't sit well with the elites who control our media and even the judiciary. Noticing the tension in her response, Stephen changed tactics. He smiled and asked a question that made everyone in the room sit up. But how do you respond to claims from some of your opponents that you and your campaign often use social media for manipulation? Susan was not intimidated. She decided to answer this question in her characteristic style. But this question marked the starting point for something much worse. Such statements only confirm that they are afraid of our influence, she said, her voice cold. We use social media because that's where the voice of the people is now. And the people no longer want to listen to the old political elites. Stephen looked at her intently, then asked, "And what about misinformation? How do you respond to the fake news that's being spread by your supporters?" The room fell silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Despite the tension in the air, Susan answered calmly, "You can't just call any information you don't like fake. We live in an era where everyone has the right to their own opinion. But I'm happy to talk about the facts if you want. I have plenty of evidence that our opponents also use manipulation." She seemed confident, but her responses were becoming increasingly aggressive. Stephen tried to steer the interview back to light humor, but he felt it was getting harder to maintain a friendly dialogue. And then, unexpectedly, something happened that no one had predicted. Stephen looked at her and said, "Do you really think that in a country where every second person has a phone, we don't need to control what people are posting? And aren't you worried that because of your words, more people are starting to believe that reality doesn't exist?" Susan froze for a moment, and her eyes turned cold. This was no longer just an interview. It had become a war of words. She composed herself and said, "What we call reality is often just an interpretation of what we're being shown. And what you call control is part of the problem, not the solution." The room fell silent. No one expected such words from Susan. This was no longer just a political debate. It was a battle of worldviews where every word could change everything. And at this very moment, when everyone was expecting another reaction, the interview took a new turn. Stephen leaned into the microphone and unexpectedly asked, "Aren't you afraid that such statements will only stir up division in the country? That when polarization returns, you won't be able to turn the situation around?" This question changed everything. Susan felt every fiber of her body react to it. She knew she couldn't make a mistake now. And at this moment, when everything was on the line, she decided to respond in a way that would turn the situation in her favor. Susan held her breath. Everyone was waiting for her response, and this moment was crucial for the further development of events. She could feel how her words could affect everything that would happen next. Colbert couldn't hide his admiration, but there was also a hint of doubt behind it. She knew this was her chance to bridge the gap between those who supported her and those who questioned her resolve. "Stephen," she began with cold confidence in her voice, "I am not afraid of division. I fear indifference. When politicians stop listening to the people just to look good in the eyes of the elites, we are on the brink of decay. Yes, the country is divided, but didn't we ourselves contribute to that division?" The room fell silent, and Stephen Colbert seemed surprised by her resolve. She looked at him and then continued, "My goal is not to drive the country into further chaos. But if we don't speak the truth, what does it matter how many times we try to be appealing to the media? People no longer believe in these hypocritical political games. I see people aged 55 and older in the U.S. who no longer want to hear excuses. They've lived through so many changes in their lives that they don't want to live in a world where the truth can be altered at will, a truth that actually matters to them." Here, Susan paused for a moment, her words hanging in the air. She began to speak about political reforms and social issues that concerned the older generation. People of this generation live in a world where they've seen the economy thrive and fall. They lived through the Great Depression. They witnessed how society changed. And today, they don't want to hear promises again. They want stability. They want their pensions to be protected, health care to be accessible, and their voices to truly count. The room was still. She knew every word she spoke mattered. Now it was crucial to make the audience understand that her fight was not just about political games, but about vital reforms that impacted their everyday lives. The real problem is that we are not giving people the chance to believe in the political system again. My campaign is not just fighting for Trump. It's fighting for everyone who wants to change the situation. It's fighting for those who no longer want to be just spectators in this political game. Stephen was taken aback by her frankness, but understood that this interview could be a turning point. Susan continued, "And that's why we need to talk about real issues. How can we, as politicians, afford to ignore economic issues, healthcare, and pension rights when so many people can no longer afford even the basics of life? And that's why we must reject this political idealism that never brings real results." Stephen watched her, his lips pressed into a line, his eyes burning with curiosity. He hadn't expected her to dive so deeply into topics that were usually favored by the older generation, who had already lived through so many historical changes. One thing was clear, this conversation wasn't over, and Susan wasn't going to back down. "And one more thing, Stephen. You can criticize my campaign, but you have to admit, we're not afraid to talk about what really concerns the people. The issues that those over 55 face cannot be ignored. This isn't just about politics, it's about human dignity. It's about whether our country is capable of being a true protector of those who gave their best years to their country and now need support." It was hard for Colbert to counter such statements, but he wasn't ready to give up. With each passing minute, these questions grew more significant, and the interview became not just a political dialogue, but a true battle for the ideas shared by millions of Americans. Susan noticed how the studio had become even more cramped. All eyes were on her, and Stephen, who was used to humor and light political jabs, now appeared somewhat bewildered. He took a deep breath, as if preparing for the next question. Susan, you're talking about stability, pensions, healthcare, but don't you think that all of this is just part of a bigger political game? He asked, trying to steer the conversation back to what seemed to him a safer topic. We know that every time efforts to change this system hit a dead end, promises turn into vague promises. How can you assure people that your campaign is really ready for these challenges and won't repeat the same mistakes? Susan immediately responded, her gaze becoming even firmer, and her voice more confident. Stephen, I understand you're looking for an easy answer, but you can't just ignore what's happening in the country. People over 55 are seeing their pensions not covering basic needs, and medical bills keep rising every year. This isn't just a political game, it's reality. I'm not saying everything will be perfect, but do you want to talk about mistakes? A mistake is when politicians stop listening to the people, when they live in their own bubble and think everything will resolve itself. We want to act, not just promise. She paused for a moment, her eyes reaching out to the viewers. She could feel how each word she spoke sparked the idea of real change in the room. People of this generation have already lived through many crises. They survived the 2008 financial crisis, the economic recession, and they know how important it is to keep the country afloat during times of economic instability. They know that action is needed, and that's why they don't want to wait any longer for politicians' empty promises. Stephen, seeing that Susan wasn't backing down, stood up, trying to steer the conversation back to more controlled waters. But aren't you afraid that this rhetoric will only deepen the divide between political camps, between those who want change and those who fear it? We don't want the country to become even more divided, do we? Yes, the country is already divided, Susan replied, her voice becoming even more persuasive. But it's not divided because of change. It's divided because of the fear of change. I'm ready to tell the people the truth, even if it means we'll be pushed to the side along the way. The division isn't because of change. It's because we are trying to ignore the real issues. People over 55 no longer want to wait for the system to start working for them. They want to see changes that will actually benefit them, and I'm ready to fight for that. These words were decisive. They were not just political rhetoric, but a reflection of her deep conviction that the important issues facing the country could no longer remain on the sidelines of politics. During this interview, Susan skillfully manipulated the moments and wove into the conversation the greatest concerns of the older generation. The real problem is that politicians no longer talk about the people, she said. They're only preparing for the next election. That's why we need to work, not just promise. We need to prioritize pensions, medical costs, access to social services, and we cannot afford to get caught up in political games. The room listened intently. Stephen Colbert stood silently, but his gaze showed that he now doubted whether he would be able to maintain the light-hearted atmosphere of the conversation. And what do you say to those who ask if you're not afraid that your actions will lead to even greater division in the country? Don't you think some people will see your rhetoric as yet another form of aggression? Stephen asked, trying to steer the situation back to a more traditional approach. Division isn't caused by the truth. It's caused by the fact that many can no longer tolerate political games. And if that's aggression, then so be it. But if we don't act, we may lose an entire generation that no longer trusts political leaders. I'm ready to fight for their votes, for their needs, and for their future. This was not just a political show. It was a real battle for the ideas that currently concern millions of Americans over the age of 55. Whose voices and concerns often go unheard by those in power. And Susan, unafraid of challenges, was only deepening this conflict, advocating for a real change. Susan felt the pressure in the studio intensifying. She knew these words could be pivotal for her campaign, but she also understood that she would have to face even greater challenges. Stephen was on the edge, watching her determination, but his face showed increasing dissatisfaction. Susan's response had become not just a political statement, but another step toward changing the mindset of the political landscape. You talk about aggression, Stephen, but this is not aggression. It's desperation, it's a drive for change, she said, her voice growing even more convincing. And you want to talk about division? Division doesn't come from change, it comes from inaction. People over 55 no longer want to hear the empty promises politicians make every 4 years, and they're no longer interested in how many times we try to pretend that everything will work itself out. We've survived the mortgage crisis, we've seen our pensions becoming less stable, and healthcare becoming less accessible. And I'm not going to hide that. Yes, the country is divided, but we cannot afford to ignore the real problems. Stephen briefly lowered his gaze, as if trying to gather his thoughts before asking the next question. But Susan, not everyone changes that quickly. We know that even with the reforms you're talking about, there's a risk of stalling economic growth. What do you say to those who fear that there could be more obstacles on the path to change than decisive actions? Susan didn't flinch. Her responses became even sharper. I'll say that the real risk is continuing to live with an old system that no longer works for the people. We've seen how the constantly rising costs of healthcare, the reduction in pension payments, and the inaccessibility of medications have left the older generation to deal with their problems alone. These people are no longer afraid of change. They're afraid of the fact that politicians no longer listen to their needs. The risk lies in leaving everything as it is. Stephen furrowed his brow. Yes, but what do you say to the fact that these changes could cost an entire economic model? What if healthcare or pension reforms lead to even greater financial difficulties for everyone, even those who are pushing for change today? Susan knew the question would be tough, but she was ready for it. I'll say that we need to take steps that promote economic recovery, not freeze the system as it is. We can't stay stagnant. People, especially the older generation, are no longer waiting for us to preserve the status quo. They want to know how we will address these issues, even if it requires risk. And if that risk leads to an economic collapse? Stephen asked, looking at her challengingly. If we don't take these steps now, we will face a much bigger economic collapse in the future, Susan replied, her voice calm but firm. And don't forget, the older generation has already lived through economic disasters. They're not afraid of change, they're afraid of inaction. Now, Stephen looked visibly surprised. He realized that this interview wasn't just about political strategies. Susan wasn't just defending her views, she was advocating for real change. And these changes addressed the most painful issues for the older generation. But aren't you afraid that your supporters might perceive these changes as an attack on their savings, or that it could lead to even more social instability? Stephen asked, trying once again to steer the conversation back to issues of economic and social balance. Instability doesn't come from change, Stephen. It comes from the fact that we can no longer afford to leave people unsupported. We cannot afford to ignore the needs of the older generation, those who have already been through so much, who can't wait for politicians to start kissing babies at the next election. People want concrete changes, real solutions, Susan said, her eyes shining with determination. The studio audience seemed to hold its breath. Susan now appeared not just as a political leader, but as a symbol for those who had long been unheard, those who needed someone to fight for their interests. She was ready not only to change the rules of the game, but to elevate these issues to a new level where the concerns of the older generation, healthcare, and social reforms could become a top priority. Stephen leaned back in his chair, his gaze less confident. He realized that Susan wasn't just answering questions. She was creating a narrative that couldn't be easily dismissed. She wasn't just a politician. She was a representative of a generation that no longer wanted to hear empty promises. This moment became a turning point in the conversation. "Susan, you're leaving no room for compromise," Stephen said, realizing that for the first time in this interview, he himself felt uncertain. But can these issues really be solved without causing even greater tension in society? I mean, can changes truly be that radical without disrupting the country's stability? Susan took a deep breath, knowing that her words mattered more than ever in this moment. "Stephen, unfortunately, we can no longer afford stability built on illusions," she said, looking directly into the camera, as if her words were meant not only for him, but for the millions watching the broadcast. "Our country stands on the brink of change, and those changes must not be just conceptual promises, but real actions. If we don't act now, if we don't change what has long been broken, the stability we fear disrupting will simply disappear. We will lose a generation that has already lost hope. They no longer want words, they want results." The room fell silent. Everyone in the studio felt the pressure of the topic filling the space. Susan knew that this moment would not just change her political career, but would leave an imprint on the minds of the people. She was trying to embody what the country had long needed. Real change, one that took into account the interests of not just the political elites, but those who had been left on the periphery of the political process for decades. Stephen looked at her, and while he was still trying to maintain control of the situation, his questions were no longer as aggressive. He understood that this discussion couldn't be wrapped up with simple rhetoric. "So you're ready for the fight," he said, as if acknowledging her resolve. Susan nodded, her voice firm. "Yes, I'm ready. And I believe that we must fight for these changes, not to win an election, but to secure a better future for those who are already feeling the consequences of the old system. And if we're not ready to fight now, then who will be ready later?" The show ended, but the room remained silent for a few more minutes. Everyone understood that today's conversation wasn't just another political debate. It had become a reflection of the real concerns of people who no longer believed in old promises and were waiting for change. The cameras turned off, and Susan looked at Stephen, smiling. She knew that, even though it hadn't been easy, she had taken a step toward becoming the leader the country needed right now. And though the battle for her views wasn't over, she was ready for it. Now, there was only one thing left: not to back down.